So this is different. I'm hoping that the microphone doesn't pick up too much background noise because our absolutely horrendous upstairs neighbors are being absolutely horrendous right now. But it's what I gotta do if I want slightly better audio for the video, right? Still having issues with the whole making videos on specific toys thing, so we're doing another completely different video, but I think it's kind of relevant anyway. The whole point of this is to go over a sort of general glossary of terms as it pertains to Transformers collecting that when I first got back into it many years ago, back in I think around like 2015, 2016, something like that, some of it just didn't quite make sense to me at first. I had to pick up on it via context, which in some cases it was not that difficult, but there's a lot of stuff that I feel like if someone's getting back into collecting or just starting collecting for the first time, they may not immediately know what some of these words mean. I will acknowledge that some of these words are probably pretty obvious, but I just wanted to make a not fully comprehensive, but kind of a at least semi-useful video going over some of these terms. Now, I also want to say this is these terms as I have come to interpret and understand them. This is not a definitive, this is what it means, but more of a how I've perceived it to be kind of widely accepted by the broader Transformers collecting community. My definitions might be just a little bit different than some other people's, but I feel like the spirit of it all is the same. This list is not in any particular order, so it's just going to be kind of all over the place. But to start, we're going to go over articulation and posability. I feel like these are both pretty obvious when you think about it for more than 2 seconds, but it's still something that I think, there's bound to be someone who might want a little clarification going in. And no judgment or anything like that. I just feel like it's worth going into. Articulation and posability refers to just the range of motion and the amount of motion that a given figure can do in whatever mode has joints. So like a car doesn't really have articulation in that, it's a car, but a humanoid robot does have articulation. I'm going to use Studio Series 86 Jazz, for example. Like articulation just refers to like shoulder swivels and in and out motion and head movements and waist swivels and that kind of thing. As I said, pretty straightforward. This one's a little bit weird to go over, but I again feel like there's bound to be someone coming into this brand new who may not know some of this stuff. And when people reference things like G1, G2, RID, Cybertron, Armada, all that stuff, they're referring to different eras of Transformers, in particular the media, but it does also tie into the toys. So like G1 is just shorthand for Generation 1, meaning the very beginning. This is where Transformers started. It is the 1980s cartoon, the 1986 movie, the original toys, like my G1 Bumblebee that I have here. They're ultimately very simple, but like most of the time when people refer to G1, they're referring to it in terms of an aesthetic and how accurate or inaccurate something might be to that original G1 cartoon look. Same thing when you go into like G2. There's G2, which was in many ways, it was just sort of G1 with an extreme 90s paint job, but there was a little more to it than that. There were some new figures released during G2 as far as I can recall, but same idea. RID is complicated. RID is short for Robots in Disguise, but Robots in Disguise can mean any of like at least 2 or 3 different things because Hasbro's just been reusing the names a lot. RID, what would it be, like 2000 something, 2001? That was the original Robots in Disguise, which was car robots in Japan, but that is the show that a lot of, at the time, newer stuff came from, like Gigatron/Megatron, Skybite, Scourge. When people talk about RID Scourge, it's Robots in Disguise Scourge, because Scourge in the 86 movie and like the 1980s cartoon is not the same Scourge as RID Scourge. But then you have Robots in Disguise, like 2014, 2015, something like that, which was a different cartoon that followed Bumblebee as a team leader of a group of Autobots on Earth, and the Decepticons were all kind of weirdly animalistic, but it was a really cool vibe, and a lot of those figures I really wish they made, or a lot of those characters rather, I really wish they made figures out of, and yeah. Armada Same thing, it's another series in Transformers history, specifically media and toys, but I think they also did comics and stuff like that. Cybertron, all that stuff, that's what it refers to. Though Cybertron in particular can also mean the planet that the Transformers came from, as well as something else that we're going to touch on later. So yeah, not confusing at all, but in this particular context, when we're talking about like G1, G2 and all that, that's what it refers to. Related to that somewhat is Bayverse. Bayverse became shorthand for just the live-action movies, basically. It does kind of get a little fuzzy when you get into the Bumblebee movie and Rise of the Beasts, because those are both, I believe, both directed by Travis Knight. Or no, Travis Knight didn't direct Rise of the Beasts, but Travis Knight directed Bumblebee, and that kind of kicked off the aesthetic from Bumblebee to Rise of the Beasts. So that has kind of fuzzily been referred to as the Knightverse, but it all is usually kind of mushed together as Bayverse, and it's just, again, shorthand for the live-action movies, whether it's referring to the characters or the designs or the toys or whatever. Similarly, you'll sometimes see or hear people refer to Bayformers, and that refers to transforming figures or characters or whatever designs that are from those live-action movies, primarily directed by Michael Bay. The ones that suck, basically. Except for the first one. The first one is not great, but it's at least entertainingly watchable. It goes so far downhill after that point, and my goodness, does that hill just keep going. When people talk about Bayverse designs, they're talking about stuff like Studio Series, Age of Extinction, Grimlock, and stuff like that. Kibble. Kibble is another one that was kind of like, it kind of makes sense when you hear it in context, but just to clarify, Kibble refers to just kind of the excess junk that hangs off of a character in robot mode or alt mode, as it were, because some alt modes do have Kibble. Kibble is in reference to extraneous bits that are on the characters, usually robot mode, but sometimes the other modes. Stuff that essentially is not there in non-physical media. So, for example, you've got the character designs in the cartoon show. A lot of them are pretty clean from all angles because they're drawings. They don't have to physically exist in the real world, so they can cheat with the way that they transform. The toys generally can't do that, or they have to be absurdly complex in order to pull a lot of stuff off so that it looks correct and clean in both modes. Which is why you have figures like Origin Jazz, where he's got a pretty decent amount of his alt mode just folded up onto his back, as well as these really big fins and stuff on the backs of his legs. So that's the kind of thing that would be considered Kibble. There are plenty of other examples out there. This is just what I grabbed off the shelf. Shell formers. Shell formers refers to a type of transformation scheme that basically has the bulk of the alt mode as a shell. How this is handled can differ. There are definitely some shell formers out there that do amazing things with the way that their shells are handled, but then there are some that aren't. I'm doing a bad job of explaining this. Shell forming is basically when the entire alt mode, or almost the entire alt mode, is a shell. A much more accurate example of shell forming is the Big Convoy mold from Beast Wars Neo, in this case represented by Universe Nemesis Prime. The alt mode is a mammoth, but the alt mode is basically just stapled to the robot frame. You could pull off pretty much all of the mammoth pieces and you'd still have a robot, and then you'd have a mammoth shell. That does include the weapon and like some of these panels on the arm. Basically, you could take all of the alt mode bits off and you'd still have a solid robot. That's more or less what shell forming refers to. Parts forming is something that you hear referenced sometimes, and whether or not something parts forms or is a parts former is kind of an important distinction, because lots of figures parts form. There are figures where a part of the vehicle mode becomes a weapon or something to that effect, and that is parts forming, but that does not necessarily make the figure a parts former. A parts former refers to a design where the engineering is primarily take everything apart and then put it back together to create a different mode. Think like Sentai stuff, like the Titan Megazord here or Maji-King, whichever you prefer. Sentai stuff is by and large almost entirely parts forming. I mean, not entirely. The combinations are parts forming, but there is transformation going on here. And that is also something to point out, that like something can parts form but still transform. It's just when the bulk of the transformation from one mode to another involves taking things apart and putting them back together in another way, or just taking things apart, because there are definitely some figures, like a Perfect Effect version of RC, which I no longer have to give it as an example. It was like you fold up the robot and then you just stick a bunch of parts on to make a motorcycle. And then when you go back to the robot mode, you take a bunch of parts off and then transform this weird looking core into a robot. So that kind of stuff is what counts as parts forming or being a parts former. We've talked about shell formers, now we need to talk about shelf warmers, which are two different things. Shell formers are figures that basically wear almost their entire alt mode as a backpack or just flaps everywhere. Shelf warmers are toys that don't sell, basically. When you walk into like a Target or something like that and you see just dozens of the same figure and it never seems to move no matter how much time passes, that's a shelf warmer. Interchangeably, there's also peg warmers, which is conceptually it's the same thing. It's more in reference to how the toy is packaged. Shelf warmers, they sit on a shelf, but it's also used interchangeably with peg warmers. Peg warmers are specifically referring to toys that are in like little bubble packages that hang on pegs on a shelf. But more often than not, you're going to see people use the term shelf warming. Okay, parts leprosy. I've heard this term used several times. I'm not the biggest fan of it because of the connotations. It just seems a little bit like we could probably come up with something better these days, but essentially it refers to parts forming in the worst way. Now, there are lots of arguments that people make for and against parts forming. I personally don't mind parts forming as long as everything has a place to go in both modes. That is not always the case with certain figures, and this term refers to when you have parts that are only usable in like one or two, if there are more than two, specific modes. I hate it. That is something that I cannot, like I despise when figures parts form and then the only thing you do with some of those parts is leave them off to the side. I'm supposed to be talking about the term, not how I feel about it. But yes, that's specifically referring to a form of parts forming where you've got parts that you just don't have anything to do with in between specific modes. C.H.U.G. This one is probably going to be the most challenging one for me to narrow down because I know what C.H.U.G refers to and I understand the meaning behind it, but I was never really in the fandom collecting stuff when this was a thing. And I also don't care anywhere near as much as a lot of people do, but C.H.U.G is in reference to, these days it's primarily used in reference to a specific scale, which sits somewhere kind of between where modern scale is now and Masterpiece. It's hard to explain in terms of scale because I've never fully gotten it myself, but it's actually an acronym that stands for Classics, Henkei, Universe, Generations. 4 different toy lines that all kind of released within the same rough few years that were beloved by many, and I understand why, because Classics Optimus Prime is still a fantastic mold, but C.H.U.G refers to kind of that catch-all. But the thing is, it's gotten more complicated over the years because people still refer to C.H.U.G scale, even though we haven't gotten Classics, Henkei, Universe, or Generations figures in the longest time. Arguably, some of the figures we've gotten in some of the earlier official lines could be considered Generations, but I feel like that might be a bit of a stretch. It's a mushy area, but that is the very, very basics of what C.H.U.G refers to. Weapon storage is pretty obvious, I think, but it's basically referring to how a given figure stores its weapon, whether that's in vehicle mode or alt mode, if they're not a vehicle, or robot mode. It can be good or bad. It really depends on the figure. Sometimes the weapon storage is practically invisible in one mode or another, and other times it's kind of egregious. This is a pretty basic term. That one I feel like very straightforward, but still something to cover. Tampos and tampographs. As this is another one that I'm kind of working off of context more than anything, but tampos is short for tampographs. Tampographs, as I understand it, is not the same thing as painting. It's not like when you have, for example, Jazz here. Bumblebee just fell over. When you've got Jazz here, most of what you see on this guy is paint. Like the headlights, the stripe in the center, the windows, the shins, that's all paint. Tampagraphs refers to things like the stripes going up the wheel wells here. I guess in a way you could think of them as slide decals, only they're not slide decals. I don't know exactly how tampagraphs are applied, but basically tampagraphs are like one solid decorative thing that's put on the figure as opposed to layer of paint, layer of paint, layer of paint. But again, going off of my own kind of context and what I've picked up along the way. But yes, tampagraph and paint, not the same thing. A super mode is essentially you've got your core robot and then a bunch of stuff gets tacked on to create a kind of super mode. So it's like a powered up version of a particular character. And depending on how specific you want to get with it, that could be anything from Energon Landmine, who has his brute mode, but like that could arguably be considered a super mode, all the way to Jinrai, or in this case, Nebulon Quest Super Convoy. This would be considered a super mode because you've got the core robot that transforms and then becomes part of this like bigger robot, but it's like the same character, just like a powered up version. The upcoming, hopefully released within the next several months, HasLab Robots in Disguise, the 2001 Robots in Disguise, Omega Prime, that is also what you could consider a super mode. Actually, two super modes, because you've got the core Prime that's made up of just the front of the fire truck, and then you slap all these armor pieces on to make the super mode, and then you combine them with Ultra Magnus to make the Omega Prime figure, which is kind of like a super mode. MP is shorthand for Masterpiece, and Masterpiece, let me grab my example here, Masterpiece G2 Sideswipe, still absolutely adore this guy. Masterpiece is kind of its own scale/aesthetic that has kind of shifted over the years. The first couple of Masterpieces were kind of rough. I know everyone loves MP01. I've never handled it personally, but I don't think it looks that great. But I also came into Masterpiece after MP10 had been established, so after Masterpiece Megatron, they started getting into a little bit more of a clearly defined path for a while, and that's where you've got like the Masterpiece Carbots, like Sideswipe, Blue Streak, that kind of thing. Then you've also got the bigger Masterpiece figures like Masterpiece Prime, MP10, but then the Masterpiece line has kind of shifted over the years, and so now you've got like a bigger focus on G1 accuracy, which we kind of touched on before actually, but that is what Masterpiece refers to, and Masterpiece has also generally been, despite how things have changed, it's kind of been a relatively stable scale. Masterpiece scale is usually, or always if you're looking at the same character, a much bigger version than your more typical in-stores line. Well, you can find Masterpiece figures in stores to a point, but yeah, like a deluxe would be, well, grab Jazz again. So like we've got Deluxe, Masterpiece. Now, these two, I believe, would be about the same height in most situations, but since these are completely separate lines and different scales, that's why they're not the same height. So like a Masterpiece Jazz would probably be closer to this height, and a non-Masterpiece Sideswipe closer to this height. MPM is basically a sort of awkward abbreviation for Movie Masterpiece, and I know it's weird because it's Movie Masterpiece, but it's abbreviated MPM, whereas it should be abbreviated MMP, but that doesn't look or sound as good, so MPM makes sense. Also, I believe it's really called Masterpiece Movie, not Movie Masterpiece, but everyone's kind of collectively just called it Movie Masterpiece. But Masterpiece Movie refers to the live-action movie figures getting their own Masterpiece toys. In this case, this has the DNA upgrades, but this is the MPM 12N, I think, Optimus Prime from the Bumblebee movie. It's about live action designs because technically the 86 movie is a movie, but that's more, G1 cartoon style, so it fits more into the regular Masterpiece aesthetic. So MPM specifically refers to live action movie figures in Masterpiece form, which means bigger, more complex, and also much more expensive. Class. We touched on this briefly, but class is difficult to define these days. It used to be size class, and you have things, we still use class today, like Core, Deluxe, Voyager, Leader, Commander, Titan, all that stuff is a class. These days, for the past several years, class has more been in reference to like a general budget. You can still expect a kind of rough estimate as to how physically large a figure might be based on its class, but for the most part, it has more to do with budget. Because like the two jazzes we've already looked at, just grab Origin Jazz here, this is a deluxe. Grimlock here, G2 Grimlock, is a leader. But look at the size, yeah, the size is definitely very different, but then also consider the complexity. Grimlock really isn't that much more complex than Origin Jazz. Despite how big this guy is, he doesn't have necessarily a ton more parts to him than this Jazz does. Obviously, he's got more mass and more plastic, but, you know, parts are a thing that also are a factor. Class just refers to all those different things. Then you have, like, the older stuff, like the Ultra Class from, like, Beast Wars and stuff like that, which are the bigger. It's kind of, Ultra Class is what I guess we could consider leaders now. And Leader Class back in the day used to be closer to what we now consider Commander Class. It's weird. It's a somewhat fluid term at this point. But right now, class is more of a price point than anything. That's a price point that's determined by like figure complexity more than size. Legends and Legion, that kind of stuff, that refers to another pseudo-size class. Think of it kind of like the modern core class, where you've got these smaller figures that are cheaper and simpler, much simpler, like usually less articulation, simpler transformations, that kind of thing. But they're meant to be more like pocket toys or fiddly desk toys. Legion and Legends, that's what all of this stuff used to be called before it became core class. But it's not even necessarily a one-to-one interchangeable thing, because there's definitely something about the spirit behind the Legion and Legends class figures that you just don't really see that much in the core class figures. Core class figures just kind of feel like they made really tiny transforming toys, whereas these feel like they were specifically designed to be like simplistic fiddle toys. Parts count just refers to how many overall pieces go into creating a specific figure. For example, Origin Jazz, I'm not counting everything on this guy, but when you're talking about parts count, you're not only saying like head, arm, leg, that kind of thing, but like every piece that makes up that head and that arm. So like his arm here, you've got at least one piece for the shoulder, one piece for the bicep, one piece for the forearm, one piece for the fist. And then if you count the shoulder assembly that attaches to the torso, that gives you 5 individual pieces at least for one arm. So that is where parts count comes in. And the reason parts count is significant is because the more parts there are, the more parts they have to make, the more plastic they have to use. Well, I mean, size is also a factor in that, but you know, more parts means just more assembly time, more stuff to paint, potentially, that kind of thing. So the more parts a figure has, generally, as I understand it, the more expensive it is to produce. Deco is shorthand for decoration, or just the overall paint scheme of a figure and just the design of the look. Like, it can usually refer to things like colors, paint layout, overall like visual design, that kind of thing. It's not in a physical molding sense, but in a, you know, colors, stripes, tampographies, stickers if they use them, that kind of thing. That's what Deco refers to. Like how Grimlock here has a primarily yellow deco because he is yellow. So his deco is based on the G2 prototype, I believe, or like an early release sample that they never actually made when they were initially advertising Grimlock for G2, or Generation 2, as we talked about earlier. Now, if you've been paying attention to Transformers toy discussions, in particular revolving around the G1 cartoon, you've probably, unfortunately, heard or seen reference to the Sunbow Chart, and I apologize if that's the case. The Sunbow Chart refers to the size chart that I think somebody made it. I don't know if it's official or not, but I think somebody made it based on just a whole lot of research, and I can respect them for that. But it refers to a size chart based around the G1 cartoon, and it's called the Sunbow Chart because the G1 cartoon, at least for a long time, was produced by a company called Sunbow. What bugs me about the chart is the fact that people still refer to it as like this holy tablet of sorts, where it's like, you know, this is the scripture, this is the thing that everything must abide by, and if it's, you know, if it's out of scale here, then it's wrong. And okay, I'm going to stop ranting. Maybe I'll make this a future video for me to rant about, but for now, the Sunbow chart just refers to this size chart that is ideally supposed to show you how each character from the G1 cartoon measures up to each other, so you can get an idea of like how tall Optimus Prime is next to Warpath, you know, that kind of thing. Scale is something we've actually talked about a few times already, and I never actually defined, but scale just refers to scale, how big a figure is, in particular how it compares to another figure. And that scale can be official, like 1/12, 1/6, like there are different, and it's always weird to me too, how like you've got 1/12 scale, 1/6 scale, you'd think 1/6 would be smaller, but 1/6 is actually way bigger. You usually see those kinds of scales in action figures like Marvel Legends and stuff like that. Those are usually 6-inch scale, which I believe is 1/12. Transformers figures, because they're transforming alien robots, they're a little bit more mushy. Like, for example, a deluxe figure like Jazz, you put them next to a Marvel Legends, they might be roughly around a similar height, though I think Marvel Legends would actually be slightly taller. I don't have any Marvel Legends to show, but theoretically, that wouldn't necessarily be the correct scale because Jazz is an entire car standing up. And so if you've got a car standing up that's this tall and a human that's normal sized, in theory, in the fiction, that's the same height, that doesn't scale. And then you also have the, for example, the Masterpiece train bots that Takara released that are done in an actual, honest-to-goodness model train scale. I forget what that scale is called, but they specifically designed them to scale in train mode with a specific scale of model trains. So yes, that's kind of a very short umbrella thing on what scale refers to. It does not refer to class. Not anymore. There is no deluxe scale. It's just deluxe class. Now, remolds, retools, and repaints. These kinds of things are... some of it's a little tricky to define, but some of it's pretty straightforward. A lot of people use these terms interchangeably. I've done it myself. It's not technically accurate to do it all the time, but sometimes you just don't care. But repaints are essentially a figure that is exactly the same as another figure, mechanically, just with a different paint scheme, or a different color scheme, or deco, if you will. We touched on that earlier. Case in point, the many iterations of Studio Series 86 Grimlock, of which I will eventually own all of them. I'm just waiting for the G2 and the Godzilla one to come out right now. But you've got G2 Grimlock, the yellow G2 Grimlock, not the blue one. I have the blue one on pre-order, and Shattered Glass Grimlock. Functionally, mechanically, molding-wise, everything, these are the exact same figure. But their colors are drastically different, hence repaint. Though, even then, calling it a repaint is technically inaccurate because it's not so much that this is painted differently than this, but like the plastic colors themselves are completely different. As I've come to understand it, remold and retool are kind of interchangeable. I'm sure depending on who you ask, they'll disagree with that, but generally speaking, as I've come to understand it, a remold or retool refers to taking an existing figure, redoing it as another character, and not only changing the color, but usually doing some slight remolding. For example, Legacy Ratbat is Studio Series 86. Was it Studio Series 86 Scourge? I think it was, yeah. So Ratbat here is Scourge. This is the Scourge figure. Aside from the colors being different, there are some minor differences in a couple of places. I believe the chest is molded differently, and of course the head. So this is not a repaint. This is more of like a remold or a retool, where they took an existing figure and character and re-released it with some minor changes and some color choices that essentially transform it into a completely different character. And I don't mean this in like a bad way. I actually think that it's cool when they do this because it's sometimes really interesting to see how they're able to take an existing mold and turn it into a completely different character. And with some, in some cases, really minor changes, it actually works really well, like in the case of Ratbat here. Coming back around to Cybertrons, specifically Cybertrons, and as it relates to Destrons. This is something that I've sort of picked up through osmosis over the years. But basically, in addition to Cybertron referring to a cartoon series, a toy line, and the planet of the Transformers, It also refers to the faction that the Autobots are in Japanese fiction. I don't know for sure because I haven't bothered doing any research, but I don't know if it's this way for all Transformers media in Japan. But for at least some of it, the Autobots in Japan, the team was referred to, the faction was referred to as Cybertrons. You can probably guess what the whole Destrons thing is, but yes, the Decepticons, for at least some of the media in Japan, are Destrons. The faction is called Destrons. So that's where those two terms come from, and Cybertrons it's so unnecessarily confusing with how they reuse stuff. Now, I talked about third party briefly, so yeah, we're going to talk about first, third, and fourth party. As far as I know, there is no second party. I guess maybe you could consider that upgrade kits, but essentially, first party refers to official toys, like officially released Hasbro and Takara products, things that you buy from Hasbro, their IP, their characters, their intellectual property, IP, their characters, Transformers. Third party refers to unofficial companies making basically Transformers toys. They're not technically Transformers toys because they don't own that property, so they don't call them that, and they don't have the same names as the characters, but they are very much supposed to be those characters. For example, Planet X's Vulcan. This is the G2 Colors version. This is very obviously Fall of Cybertron Grimlock, but this toy is not Fall of Cybertron Grimlock, it's Planet X Vulcan, because it's a third-party company. Planet X is not Hasbro or Takara, so they are third-party. They have made this figure. This figure is its own thing. It's not cribbing from Hasbro's toy designs or anything like that. It's obviously taking the character design from the game, but the actual engineering and stuff is its own thing. So that is essentially what third party refers to. Fourth party refers to stuff like this. This is not that recently-ish released Nemesis Colors version of Studio Series, whatever number this is, Optimus Prime. This actually came out well before that, to the point where I was confused when they did the official release of this in Nemesis Colors, because it was like, this thing's been out for like over a year, maybe even 2 years at this point. Why are you bothering? But this is fourth party. This is a knockoff, which is, well, we'll kind of blend them together. Knockoff and KO, fourth party, all the same thing. Fourth party is a term given to knockoffs because people don't like saying knockoffs in some instances. I just figured just call them knockoffs, but it's kind of a, I guess, cheeky way of skirting the fact that what you're holding in your hand is an unlicensed reproduction. And I don't mean unlicensed as in they took a figure and made something based on a character they don't own the rights to. I mean, this is that Studio Series Optimus Prime figure, just knocked off. It is an unofficial reproduction, straight up reproduction of that figure, just in Nemesis colors. So that's kind of the key difference between third party and fourth party / knockoff, in that a knockoff takes an existing Hasbro or Takara or even third party figure and just reproduces it. A completely different company just reproduces it. Whereas third party is making a figure based on a character they don't own the rights to, but the figure itself, the physical object, is something they did design on their own. That is the important distinction. I'm not saying whether or not something is like morally okay. That's an area and an argument I don't feel like making right now, but that is the distinction. So wrapping this up, there's also Toyhax or Reprolabels. This refers to stickers. Origin Jazz here is a good example of that. You may notice there are lots of details on this guy that are not on him directly out of the box. That's because I have a set of Reprolabels on him. Toyhax is the name of the company that makes Reprolabels, though people sometimes use Toyhax as the phrase referring to the stickers themselves. That's technically incorrect, but like it gets the point across, so it's not hurting anybody, it's whatever. But Reprolabels specifically refer to the stickers. And you get these sticker sheets, sticker sets that allow you to add more detail to a figure, or in some cases completely convert them to a different character if you want. It really helps a lot of figures. Like sometimes there might be a few details where you feel like it's just missing that little something, and sometimes the sticker sets add that little something. Or even better, that Stalker conversion kit, not even kit, that Stalker conversion sticker set that I did a video on a little while back that takes that Cyberverse universe Tarn that came in that 4-pack with Cliff Jumper, Legacy Cliffjumper, and turns him into G2 Stalker. And this sticker set takes a figure that I thought was like, it's a good figure, but I didn't really care much for the Cyberverse color scheme, and it turns it into something that is absolutely incredible. I like this more than the actual like regular Tarn figure. This is the kind of thing that really makes Reprolabels worthwhile. IDW, Dreamwave, in some cases Marvel, you might see these things referenced as well. And these are referring to specifically a era of Transformers comics. You've got the Marvel comics, IDW comics, Dreamwave comics, and some other comics, I'm sure. The reason these are referred to a lot in the fandom is because there have been figures, both official and otherwise, made based on the designs that were used in these comics. In addition to, say, Optimus Prime being like, you know, the G1 Prime and G2 Prime and Armada Prime, Cybertron Prime, that kind of thing, you also get IDW Prime, Dreamwave Prime, Marvel Prime. Now, Marvel Prime generally looks about the same, but the colors are different. And also it depends on whether you're looking at the US or the UK releases, because that's a whole thing. IDW and also different versions, like IDW had several storylines, so like there might be more than one IDW design for a given character. Dreamwave, all that stuff, it's like it all kind of refers to comic designs for characters, but those have rolled into toys. Velocitron Blur is heavily based on his IDW design, as far as I understand it. So it's that kind of thing. Sprues are something you might also see referenced sometimes, usually when referring to things like budget and parts counts. If you're familiar with making models, then you probably know what a sprue is, but if not, it's basically just a thing of plastic that all the little parts are on, that those parts get snipped off of before assembly. So the sprue is this sort of plastic frame, almost like a wire frame, just a flat wire frame that holds these individual parts in. And then, again, those parts get snipped out and assembled, and you have a figure. A Greeble is something that has come up a few times, and I've used it myself many times, but it's essentially shorthand for texture. Greeble just basically refers to lots of little intricate molded details all over a figure. Like you got all the jaggedy textures on Studio Series Age of Extinction Grimlock, some finer molded details on the Studio Series 86 Grimlock mold, like up in the shoulders and stuff like that. Some molded line work in the hood on Studio Series 86 Jazz, because, you know, if this was strictly sticking to the G1 cartoon aesthetic, there would not really be any texture on that hood, because, you know, it's a cartoon. It was just a smooth white surface, but that's the point. I think y'all get it. And when people use the term brick in referring to a Transformers figure, it's basically just a quick way of saying the figure doesn't have a lot of posability. Case in point, most G1 toys. Most G1 toys are what people would consider a brick because they just don't really pose. Like Bumblebee can move his arms up and down, but like they don't really stay because it's an old figure. The legs can kind of telescope up and down, and the feet can do that, and the head can move up and down, but like he doesn't really pose. You're not going to get this guy into any kind of extreme poses or any poses at all, really, because he just kind of stands there. There is some posing possibility with some of them. Dreadwind, for example, can't really do a whole lot, but like you can move his arms forward, you can bend his elbows, you can swivel his wrists, kick his legs out to the side a little bit, and kick his knees forward for some reason. So yeah, that's the brick. Now, combiners or gestalts, again, something that a lot of people who are watching this probably already know, but just in case, combiners refer to these big guys behind me. It's essentially a single robot that is made up of multiple smaller robots. How that is determined is kind of a little bit of a gray area, because you've, of course, got the obvious combiners like Superion, Defensor, Menasor, Bruticus, Computron, almost forgot about Computron, Victorion. Then you have some that are a little bit more mushy, like when you've got two robots that combine to make one bigger robot. Is that a combiner? Depending on who you ask, depending on the toy itself, yes or no. So it's a little bit fuzzy, but basically combiners refer to anything that's like more than one robot combining to make a bigger robot. And finally, for now, because this is all the stuff I could think of before actually sitting down, or standing up in this case, because Astrid's been sleeping in my chair, which is why I'm standing at my desk and the angle is a little bit different. But These are all the things I could come up with before actually filming, and for the last of it, it's all the different masters, like Targetmasters, Headmasters, Power Masters, that kind of thing. And this refers to different, like, gimmicky toys, and specifically each one refers to a different gimmick. Like Headmasters were figures where the heads would pop off and become little figures, and those little figures would ride in the robot mode, alt mode. We got a return to Headmasters in, well, first we got a little bit in Thrilling 30 when they did Brainstorm. That was like the first time I think we got a Headmaster officially in a while. They revisited again with Titan's Return. They called them Titan Masters, but Titan Masters and Headmasters, same deal. But there were a few more Headmasters over the years when we got like the Monster Bots that came out kind of after Titan's Return, kind of in a mushy area there. There were some Takara Legends figures based on the Titan's Return figures, usually with much better paint schemes, you know, that kind of thing. Targetmasters are referring to little robot characters that turned into weapons, typically guns. These were also kind of interchangeable because they changed they didn't call them Targetmasters in like Earthrise and Siege, but you had what were basically Targetmasters. They were little robots that turned into weapons, and that was the whole thing. They just turned into weapon accessories for the bigger, like proper sized figures. They're these much smaller figures. Power Masters are a similar thing. It's a small robot figure that became an accessory basically for a bigger one. And we're going to bring this guy back again because he is a Power Master. There's this little engine in the front there. It does come out. This little engine is a little dude. I don't know what this guy's name is because this is the non-Power Master Prime version, but it's just a little dude. And this is a Power Master. It's just little human character that can kind of do stuff in the other modes. This guy in particular doesn't really do anything in the vehicle mode, except be an engine on the front of the cab, as you could already see. But he can sit in like the guns in the base mode. And they're like Battle Masters, Micromasters, and that kind of thing. But essentially it's just blank master typically refers to small robot that turns into small thing. The Micromasters were just little robots that turned into little vehicles that were meant to compete with Micro Machines. So they probably called them Micromasters specifically to compete with Micro Machines, and the name just kind of stuck. So yeah, that's all that stuff. And that's everything I've got, which is good because my goodness, do I need to drink some water and stop talking for a while. But hopefully this has been, if not helpful and informative, at least semi-amusing for folks watching this. I'm hoping once I edit this down, it won't be quite so long. Really hope it comes in under an hour, like a lot under an hour, we'll see. But if you made it to the end, thank you all for watching. I've got Ko-fi, Patreon, links to both down in the description as well as at the end of the video. It's all much appreciated. Or like, comment, share, subscribe, that also helps out. Whatever you're comfortable with. Thank you everybody for watching, and I don't know what the next video is going to be. Hopefully it'll be decent. You all won't hate it.